second point of the 5-point plan is to plan and prepare. You need to do your homework. You need to understand your group's needs, have a sense of the range of views you're likely to hear at the session, be clear on the group's purpose and goals for the session, and you need to develop a plan to achieve those goals, a process plan. Don't ever agree, as I did a few times in the early days, to just turn up and facilitate a session without first doing your homework. It can go wrong in many ways. So the planning and preparation phase consists of 3 key tasks. 1, engage with your client. 2, design your process plan. And 3, make sure the venue's right and the logistics. Okay, let's go through them. The extent of your engagement with the client will depend on your previous involvement with them, the amount of time you have, and the size of the facilitation job. But it's obviously critical to have at least one pre-meeting in order to introduce yourself, get to know a bit about them, get some clarity around their needs and their expectations for the session in order to go away and design a good process plan. Now, a bit of clarification about the word client. I'll use Ed Shine's definition here. He says that your client can include the initial contact client who first approached you about the job, and then there is your primary client, who is the group of people you'll be working with. And to be pure about this, you can extend the definition to the whole organisation. But the people in the room when you do the job are obviously your most immediate client. You need an initial meeting with your contact client and 1 or 2 of their colleagues in order to clarify the group's needs and expectations from the session, but also to build the relationship. This meeting is an important opportunity to reveal a bit about yourself through your interactions with them and ultimately satisfying both parties that you should be working together. You can be sure the impressions you make in the initial meeting will find their way to the rest of the group. You need to discuss your approach to working with groups. Often from what you hear at the meeting, you can make some preliminary suggestions for the process, although you obviously need to go away and reflect further on what you've learned before finalising your process plan. I like to make clear at this meeting also that my approach is to use my preference as participative processes and wherever possible consensus decision making. Consensus doesn't mean everyone thinks a decision is the best. It means that everyone, having had a chance to be heard and argue their preferences, agree to support a decision, even where some may have preferred an alternative. Depending on the issue, the group is presenting with some typical questions for the planning meeting might be: what are some of the key issues you're facing? What do you see as your purpose or goals for the session? Why did you decide to engage a facilitator? And what are your expectations for the session? I also sometimes like to ask, what would it look like if it went well? The answers to these questions will help you to anticipate the work of the actual session. Well, really, in effect, you've begun the work of the session at the pre-meeting. At the planning meeting, you also need to clarify who will attend the session and, if appropriate, decide which group members you'll meet with in one-on-one consultations. And whilst, as we discussed, your role is focused on the process, it's good to know a little bit about the background and the content of the group. So ask for copies of any relevant plans or reports, etc., that you can read before the workshop to give you some of that context. Finally, at the planning meeting, it's important to make clear your process for after the session. That'll include things like getting feedback from participants and a follow-up meeting with your contact client, usually a week or so after the session, to discuss the feedback and any follow-up activities that might benefit the group. If possible, a series of additional short one-on-one sessions with group participants is an invaluable way to gain a deeper insight into the range of views you're likely to hear in the session. With small groups of 5 or 6 people, you might be able to have these one-on-ones with all group members, but with larger groups, you need to get a representative sample of the range of views you're likely to hear in the group. Face-to-face is always best, but you can do it over the phone if distance or other logistics are a challenge. The structure of these one-on-ones should also be fairly informal. It's good to find out first a bit about the person, their role, their history with the organisation, and then it's about similar questions to those from the planning meeting in order to canvass their personal views on those issues for the group. Okay, so you've had your planning meeting, and so armed with an understanding of the purpose of the session, the goals or outcomes the group is trying to achieve, and a sense of the range of views on the issues, you can now turn to planning your process. And so, what do the group need to do to achieve their goals for this session? What questions do they need to answer? What process will help them answer these questions? Some common processes that you might use and that I've described in some detail in the manual include the following: undertaking a SWOT analysis. I'm sure you know that one. It's still good. What do we do well? What could we do better? What are the opportunities and threats in the environment? They're good questions. Or alternatively, or following that, you could go to developing a shared vision where you propose a scenario such as something like, it's 5 years down the track. In the past 5 years, we've all done a great job. What does it look like? That's a good question for groups. Or you might go to more definition with defining exactly what the goals are for the group in the next 2 or 5 years. Then there's developing strategy. How do we get there? What's the best use of our limited resources? And what have we got to get right? And then you can go on to action planning to flesh out the strategy. Then, of course, it could be developing an evaluation framework where you want to know, how would we know if we got there? Or analysing training needs, what are the skills we need to help get us there? Answering these sorts of questions accounts for much of the important work that groups do. And at their core, all of these processes consist of 2 fundamental tasks. And they are collecting information and analysing information and making decisions. Recall from the Fido model that information is the raw material for decisions. The better the information exchanged in the meeting, the better the decisions. The decisions the group makes are the link between today's meeting and the future outcomes they seek. So what all groups need are simple, robust processes to collect information, analyse it and make decisions. So you need to bear this in mind, but in terms of your process for the group, once you've established the purpose or goal of the session, and before you get to structured processes for collecting and analysing information, there's another task, and that is people need to get oriented to the topic and get a sense of the range of views around the room. At this stage, you might know more about that than they do. So a good first step is for everyone to say a short bit about where they are on the key issue or issues. This is their opening comments. This is important for the group dynamics because when everyone in the room knows basically what everyone else's position is on the key topics, they have a sense of the boundaries of the discussion. And this boundary reduces anxiety and focuses people. We all like clarity and structure. It helps people understand where they need to go to have the important conversations and make good decisions. So you need a simple process to get everyone's position or top of head, if you like, thoughts on the topic at hand. And to do this, you can use rounds. You may have heard of rounds, structured rounds or unstructured rounds. With structured rounds, everyone speaks on the topic in a prescribed order without interruption. The unstructured version is there is no order, people speak as they want to. With some groups, you might not need every person to speak on the topic. You might just need to hear the thoughts of a representative from each stakeholder group. That'll be the case with bigger groups. The first step can also be used to clarify the dimension of the topic and any particular terminology, but without getting into detailed discussions ahead of your process. Okay, with those preliminaries out of the way, it's now to the core work of collecting and analysing information. For collecting information, a simple process that can be applied, well, for analysing information as well actually, goes like this. It's got 3 steps. First, invite the group members to reflect individually on the topic without discussion and ask them to jot down their initial thoughts on the topic. Very important to not skip this stage. Then break the large group into small groups of 3 to 5 people. Depending on the size of the group, you might use pairs if it's a small group. Nominate a scribe for each small group to record the ideas, whether it's on chart paper or coloured cards. Depending on the task, give the small group 10 or 20 minutes to work on the issue and advise them they will have 3 or 5 minutes to report back to the large group. Very important to give this clarity in your instructions. Also, make clear that within the small group, each person discusses their ideas in turn. Everyone listens respectfully to each other. Listeners can ask questions for clarification, and the scribe lists all the ideas before general discussion. Everyone has their say. You can at this point invite the small group to build on the ideas by brainstorming, or you can wait till you come back to the large group. I'll talk a bit more about brainstorming in a minute. It is, however, important to hear from each person before brainstorming. It goes some of the way to avoiding one of the limitations of brainstorming, which is that typically just a few people get in all the ideas, and some voices aren't heard at all. And that can lead to conflict, which we'll talk about later. The small groups then take it in turns, reporting back to the large group. It can be helpful to do this in rounds also, with each small group reporting back just one of their ideas on a topic at a time, so that the first group doesn't cover everything before any other group has a go. What normally follows is a general discussion on the ideas generated, people wanting to understand each other's thinking before moving to a more structured analysis of the information and whatever decisions the group wants to make. As with a small group, it can be a good idea to have the group examine the list and see whether they can identify any obvious clusters of ideas, goals, strategies, things that overlap or go together. As I mentioned, groups can brainstorm in either the small or large group discussions. I'm sure you've done plenty of brainstorming. It's a process where you get the group to generate a large number of ideas quickly and encourage creativity and flexible thinking. You invite everyone to say whatever ideas come into their heads without censorship and as fast as possible. You get all the ideas on the butcher's paper or on the cards, and people can build on each other's ideas, identifying connections and clusters. Interestingly, whilst traditionally the rules of brainstorming are that people don't evaluate or comment on suggestions, recent research is suggesting that brainstorming is actually more effective when there is some positive challenging of the ideas. As we discussed earlier, in effective groups, members are comfortable challenging each other's thinking in a positive way. Okay, with that process, the main variation I sometimes use is to skip the small group discussion. That means going straight from the individual reflection to the large group. But to reiterate, what I don't do is avoid giving people the opportunity to reflect individually first on the topic. Okay, so now the group has generated a large amount of information. It's time to analyse it and make some decisions. Making decisions is usually about either reducing a large list to small lists, prioritising, or choosing one solution from two or more solutions, that is, choosing among alternatives, whether it's alternative strategies, alternative policies, recommendations, etc. The overarching issue for most groups is that there's always too much to do. And one definition of strategy that I like is simply to say strategy is the best use of scarce resources. And the scarce resources are often people's time. Okay, so how can we do this? Reducing lists. Well, a high-functioning group can sometimes just look at the options they've generated, have some discussion, and agree quite quickly on the priorities to be actioned. But this is pretty rare. Normally you need a more methodical process for the group to work through what they've generated and identify the priorities. So I want to describe a couple of ways you can do this. The simplest is to get the group members to rate each item on the list as either a must, a should, or a could. Some people prefer high, medium, or low, but I prefer the language of must, should, or could. I think it carries more urgency. To do this process, first, number every item on the list. Don't forget that step. Then simply go through the list and ask the group to rate each item as either a must, critical to success, has to be included, a should, important to success but not absolutely necessary, or a could, which nice to have but maybe a luxury. Well, I describe this as a quick and dirty process that can be done as a whole group. If, however, there is a lot of confusion or argument, you can go to a more methodical version of it by having individuals rate each item and then average the ratings to reach a decision. A second and more extensive process is to use a voting system. Again, keep it simple. A simple system I use a lot goes like this. I give everyone 4 votes. They have 2 votes worth 2 points for their highest priority items and 2 more votes worth 1 point for their next highest priority items. You then go through the list item by item, simply asking for a show of hands for the votes people have assigned to each item. 1 hand for 1 vote, 2 hands for 2 votes. Then simply count up the total number of votes for each item and you've identified your priorities. If, however, people are having trouble rating the priority of items, you might find it useful to have the group generate the pros and cons associated with each option to tease out more information that the group needs to consider. So there you have it. These are some of the basic processes for collecting and analysing information that you may want to consider when designing your process plan. Additional processes are described in the manual. Here's a sample of the way I approach designing process plans. Your process plan needs to describe each process activity and usually an estimate of the time required for the activity. You might like to write more detail than this to give yourself specific instructions on what to say to the group at each point. I sometimes do this. And if you're new to the role, it can obviously be really handy if your mind freezes up. As with all plans, keep it as simple as possible. Sometimes a diagram summarising your process with flowchart, arrows, etc. can help people understand what you have in mind. Again, this is your proposal to them. You need to be flexible. As with all things, it's a starting point, a sketch, a mud map. It's not set in stone. It's very important to understand that you will often have to vary your plan as the situation requires. This is one of the key tasks of facilitating, to review the process in the light of things that emerge as a group goes about its work. And having a plan actually helps you respond spontaneously, ironically it seems, because it frees you up to focus on the present, knowing you've got a plan there, you've got a tentative process route mapped out. Okay, before we leave this discussion of process planning, I'd like to make one final important point. Don't fall into the trap of thinking it's your job to fix every problem of the group. You can't do everything in the group format. As you go about your pre-workshop session consultation, you will invariably come across evidence of niggles within the group. Sometimes, as a new facilitator, you might want to take this all on, falling into the trap of thinking it's your job to resolve all the group's problems. It's not. You need to keep a clear focus on the main game, the work of the session, the purpose of the session. And it's amazing how many of these conflicts dissolve when a group actually focuses on the work that needs to be done. The work of exchanging information, making decisions together is actually team building. Okay, and finally, the last word for this section is on the physical conditions. You've got to get them right. Remember Maslow's hierarchy? The last word on preparation is that the physical setting is important. Wherever possible, check the venue in person, or at least ring the venue, and be aware of the space available, including the breakout areas for small group discussion. Wherever you can, take your own technology and certainly whiteboard markers and pens, etc. And think about the room setup. Structure the room to encourage information exchange. Avoid classroom lecture style layouts. You can see some examples there next to me. People have to be comfortable and the technology has got to work, or your best laid, most sophisticated process plan won't come to much.